In the cold winter of 1398, beneath the scorching December sun, a terrifying force approached the ancient gates of Delhi, a city unprepared for the storm about to descend upon it. Timur, known to history as Tamerlane, was no ordinary conqueror. He was a harbinger of destruction, a shadow that stretched from the vast steppes of Central Asia to the rich plains of northern India. His name alone whispered fear into the hearts of millions. But this was not just a man on a campaign for land or power. He was a living embodiment of terror, a ruthless force who understood that sometimes the most potent weapon was not the sword, but the dread it inspired. As his army advanced, leaving a trail of ruin and despair in its wake, Delhi stood as the next inevitable victim, its mighty walls and armies no match for the calculated cruelty that Timur wielded with cold precision. The people of Delhi, many unarmed and bound, became silent witnesses to a fate far worse than death in battle. This was a darkness that did not simply aim to conquer, but to break spirit and will to erase any hope of defiance. The sheer scale of destruction was staggering, a grim reminder that in the brutal calculus of medieval war, mercy was a currency Timur refused to spend. His arrival at Delhi was not merely the clash of armies, but the beginning of an orchestrated nightmare. It was a moment frozen in time where the fate of tens of thousands was sealed by a man who ruled not just with might, but with a terrifying vision of power that demanded total submission. The echoes of that December sun still resonate centuries later, reminding us of the devastating cost when humanity succumbs to the shadow of ruthless ambition. The Battle of Delhi was not just a confrontation of armies, it was a chilling display of cunning and cruelty that shattered hope and shattered a city's defenses in one fell swoop. Facing a large but hastily gathered force, the Delhi Sultanate relied heavily on its war elephants, massive beasts armored in chainmail and spiked symbols of strength and tradition. But Timur, the ruthless warlord, understood that brute force alone would not win this fight. Instead, he unleashed a terrifying strategy. Camels set ablaze were driven into the elephant lines, sending the mighty creatures into a panicked frenzy. The chaos that followed was catastrophic. The elephants, once the terror of battlefields, became uncontrollable, trampling their own troops and turning the tide in Timur's favor. It was a calculated stroke of genius, a reminder that in war, innovation and fear often work hand in hand. Yet the true horror did not end with the collapse of the army. The city lay defenseless, and the lives of tens of thousands hung in the balance. Timur's campaign was never about mere conquest, it was about absolute domination through terror. His soldiers rounded up over 100,000 prisoners, mostly Hindu civilians, and fearing rebellion during occupation, Timur issued a horrifying command, and all were to be executed in a single day. No exceptions. Men, women, children, and the elderly all were slaughtered without mercy. This massacre was not the result of blind rage, but a deliberate act of psychological warfare designed to instill a lasting fear that would echo far beyond Delhi's fallen walls. Timur's sword was not just a weapon, it was a message. Defiance would be met not with negotiation or mercy, but with total annihilation. The silence that followed was deafening, a brutal testament to the terrifying power of calculated cruelty. The city of Isfahan once stood as a shining jewel of Persia, a vibrant center of culture, wealth, and life. Yet beneath its grandeur lay a fragile thread of peace, easily shattered by the wrath of a conqueror who demanded total obedience. When the people of Isfahan dared to rebel against Timur's rule in 1387, they set in motion a nightmare unlike any other. What began as a surrender soon spiraled into one of medieval history's most horrific massacres. Timur's fury was merciless. Tens of thousands were slaughtered in cold blood as punishment for defiance. But it was not just the sheer number of lives lost that horrified the world, it was how Timur chose to display his vengeance. In a grim, calculated act, his forces erected 28 towering monuments built from the skulls of the dead. These ghastly towers rose high above the city, their macabre construction a chilling warning to anyone who might contemplate rebellion. Each skull was placed with haunting precision. Soldiers, civilians, clerics, ranked even in death. The towers were not random piles of bones, but deliberate statements carved from human flesh and bone. For years, these skull pyramids stood as grim reminders of the cost of defiance, visible to all who passed by. Timur never hid behind excuses or remorse. Instead, his official chronicles framed these horrors as necessary steps to restore order through fear. The message was clear, and brutal resistance would be crushed not with mercy or dialogue, but with absolute annihilation. The towers of Isfahan remain etched in history not merely as symbols of past cruelty, but as warnings of how power wielded without conscience can reduce a flourishing city and its people to nothing more than skulls and silence. In the annals of medieval warfare, promises were often broken, but few betrayals cut as deeply as what transpired in the city of Sivas in 1400. The defenders, weary from siege and desperate to save their lives, accepted Timur's vow that no blood would be spilled if they surrendered. It was a fragile hope, a desperate grasp at mercy in a world ruled by ruthless ambition. Yet Timur's promise was a twisted weapon in itself, a cruel game of words that concealed unspeakable horror. Instead of sparing the soldiers, Timur ordered 3,000 of them to be buried alive. No swords were drawn, no blood was shed on the battlefield, but the earth itself became the executioner. Trenches were dug, prisoners thrown in, and the soil buried them while they still breathed an agonizing death that defied mercy or honor. This act of calculated cruelty shattered any illusion that surrender guaranteed safety or dignity. It sent a terrifying message across Anatolia: submission was no shield from Timur's wrath. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the echoes of buried screams and broken trust. Cities that once considered resistance quickly fell into fearful submission, haunted by the fate of those suffocated beneath the earth. Timur's deception transformed a solemn promise into a nightmare, weaponizing language and trust to deepen the terror of war. The betrayal at Sivas was not just a military tactic, it was psychological warfare on its darkest scale, eroding hope and crushing spirit before armies even met on the field. Long after the soil settled, the memory of that horror endured, a chilling reminder of how absolute power wielded without conscience leaves scars far beyond the battlefield scars on humanity itself. Timur's campaigns were more than mere conquests. They were brutal orchestrations of fear meticulously crafted to break the human spirit and erase any flicker of rebellion. Each city he attacked wasn't just defeated, it was obliterated, its people reduced to whispers and bones, its culture threatened with extinction. His reign was marked not only by the physical destruction wrought by his armies, but by a psychological terror that transcended the battlefield. The skull towers of Isfahan and the buried alive soldiers of Sivas were not only horrific acts of violence, they were symbols, dark monuments erected to instill dread across vast lands. Timur understood that the might of his sword was less effective than the fear it inspired. His twisted promises and merciless executions sent shockwaves through entire regions, forcing cities to surrender before a single arrow flew. But beneath this ruthless strategy lies a haunting question. What remains of humanity when power is wielded without mercy? Timur's legacy challenges us to confront the darkest capacities of human nature, how ambition and cruelty can shatter lives and erase empathy. His campaigns carve scars not just on the earth, but deep into history's memory, reminding us that terror can be a weapon, as devastating as any army. And while empires rise and fall, the echoes of Timur's reign endure, chilling reminders of what happens when the thirst for power extinguishes compassion. In reflecting on these brutal chapters, we are compelled to ask ourselves, how do we preserve our humanity in the face of overwhelming cruelty? Timur's story is a solemn warning that when mercy is abandoned, what remains may no longer be truly human. Timur's campaigns were not mere wars of conquest. They were deliberate acts of terror designed to crush resistance and rewrite the fate of entire cities. With every ruthless massacre and every twisted promise broken, he etched a legacy of fear into the very bones of the lands he conquered. His reign was defined by a merciless calculus, one where submission was demanded without question and defiance was met with total annihilation. The skull pyramids towering over Isfahan and the horrifying burial alive of soldiers at Sivas were not random acts of brutality, but carefully crafted messages, terrifying monuments to the power of psychological warfare. Timur understood that the true weapon in his arsenal was not just the sword, but the dread he inspired, fear that spread faster than any army could march. Cities did not merely fall under his rule, they were erased, their people silenced in the most chilling ways imaginable. This reign of terror challenges us to ask profound questions about the nature of power and humanity. When mercy is cast aside what is left of the human soul, Timur's story is a stark reminder of how unchecked ambition and cruelty can consume not only lands, but the very essence of civilization. The terror he sowed was more than physical destruction. It was an assault on hope, trust, and the very bonds that hold societies together. Yet even as history condemns his actions, it also forces us to reflect on the resilience of the human spirit. Amidst the ruins and bones, stories survive, stories of survival, resistance, and the enduring quest for justice. Timur's legacy is a chilling testament to the darkest chapters of history, but also a call to remember that even in the face of overwhelming cruelty, humanity must find its strength to endure and rise again. The story of Timur's reign is more than a chronicle of conquest and cruelty. It is a haunting reflection on the fragile boundaries between power and humanity. His campaigns stand as stark reminders of what happens when the thirst for domination drowns out mercy, empathy, and the very essence of compassion. Timur's relentless brutality, mass executions, skull towers, and twisted promises forces us to confront a chilling question. When power abandons mercy, what remains of humanity? History shows us that unchecked ambition can reduce entire cities to ruins, erase cultures, and leave scars that echo through centuries. Yet within this darkness, there is also a profound lesson. The terror Timur wielded was not just a display of strength, but a weapon designed to break the spirit of resistance. It reminds us how fragile freedom can be when confronted by overwhelming force and fear. But it also highlights the resilience of the human soul, how even amidst devastation, stories of courage, survival, and hope endure. Reflecting on Timur's legacy urges us to consider our own responsibility to recognize the dangers of cruelty masked as power, and to hold on to the values that safeguard our humanity. It is a call to remember that true leadership is not defined by the ability to destroy, but by the capacity to build, to heal, and to inspire. As we look back at the shadows of history, Timur's story challenges us not only to remember the horrors of the past, but to commit ourselves to a future where mercy triumphs over fear and where the dignity of every human life is upheld against the darkest tides of power. As we close this chapter on Timur's reign of terror, we are left with a haunting legacy etched in fire and bone, a legacy that forces us to face uncomfortable truths about power, cruelty, and humanity. Timur's story is a stark reminder that when mercy is cast aside, darkness can consume not only cities and empires, but the very soul of civilization itself. Yet within this shadow lies a powerful lesson. True strength is not born from fear or destruction, but from compassion, justice, and the courage to choose mercy over vengeance. History teaches us that terror may silence for a time, but it can never extinguish the enduring human spirit. It is up to us to remember these lessons, not to glorify brutality, but to ensure that the mistakes of the past never repeat. In a world still too often scarred by violence and oppression, may we find the wisdom to build bridges instead of walls, to heal wounds instead of inflicting them, and to lead with humanity at the heart of our power. Because in the end, what defines us is not the empires we conquer, but the kindness we leave behind.